Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, power can be a really tricky thing, like inheriting the most powerful position in the world. Sounds great, right? But imagine if that position came with a constant reminder of your family's tragic fate, a constant shadow over everything you do. That's the world Caligula walked into.
It's a story that I think resonates with a lot of people, because who among us hasn't felt the weight of family history, the echoes of the past shaping our present?
And that's what we're going to explore today, the life and reign of Caligula, this Roman emperor who is really shrouded in myth and legend.
Yeah, and we're going to be sifting through the historical accounts, trying to separate fact from fiction, and hopefully along the way we'll get a better understanding of the man behind the madness.
Was he truly a monster? Or a victim of circumstance? Or maybe, and I think probably most likely somewhere in between.
Right, because human beings are complicated, and when you throw absolute power into the mix, so things can get really, really messy.
So let's start with what we know. Caligula, born Gaius Caesar in 12 AD, was basically Roman royalty.
Oh yeah, I mean his father, Germanicus, was a beloved war hero. And his mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a direct descendant of Augustus.
The first emperor of Rome. Talk about a pedigree. But as we all know, family trees can be more like tangled vines.
Especially in ancient Rome. And this family, oh, they were right in the middle of some serious power struggles.
And that brings us to Caligula's childhood, which, let's face it, was anything but normal. I mean, we all know the nickname, Caligula meaning little boots, which almost sounds cute, doesn't it?
It does, right? But like so much of Caligula's story, there's a darker side to that seemingly innocent nickname. Those little boots were part of a tiny military uniform he wore as a child.
A mascot for his father's legions. Can you imagine?
I mean, it's almost a little heartbreaking, isn't it? This child, surrounded by soldiers, living in a world where power was everything and danger lurked around every corner.
Because the reality was that his family's position made them a target.
Oh, absolutely. And especially from Emperor Tiberius, his great uncle, who was, shall we say, not known for his warmth and generosity.
To put it mildly. And then there was Sejanus.
The powerful Praetorian prefect, a master manipulator who, let's be honest, was basically pulling the strings behind the scenes.
And Caligula's family. Well, they were caught right in the middle of this web of paranoia and ambition.
They became victims of Tiberius and Sejanus's machinations. It was a systematic takedown. One by one, they were eliminated.
His mother, Agrippina, accused of treason, exiled, and eventually died. Probably from starvation.
A brutal end. And then his brothers, Nero and Drusus.
They met similarly tragic fates, accused of treason, forced to commit suicide, or left to die in prison.
It's like something out of Shakespeare. The rise and fall of a powerful family, the constant threat of betrayal, the struggle for survival, and all of this played out right in front of Caligula.
And we can't forget that he was forced to live with Tiberius on the island of Capri.
A gilded cage. But a cage nonetheless.
Did you imagine? This teenager forced to be a companion to the man who had orchestrated the destruction of his family.
He had to watch his every word, every action, knowing that one wrong move could mean his own demise.
It's enough to mess with anyone's head. And I think it's safe to say that this experience had a profound impact on Caligula.
Absolutely. It shaped his worldview, his understanding of power, and perhaps it even planted the seeds for the tyranny that would later define his reign.
So here we have Caligula, carrying the weight of his family's tragedy, living under the watchful eye of a paranoid emperor. But then fate takes a turn. Tiberius dies.
Leaving a power vacuum and a nation yearning for change. Enter Caligula, 24 years old. Charismatic, carrying the legacy of his father, Germanicus, the beloved war hero. The Roman people were ready for a new era, a change, and I think a return to like the glory days of the Julio-Claudian dynasty.
It's kind of like when a new band comes out, everyone's excited to hear their music. The Roman public was just ecstatic. They saw Caligula as this glimmer of hope after years of, well, let's be honest, Tiberius's oppressive rule.
He was like a rock star, right? He returns to Rome and totally plays the part of the benevolent emperor like to perfection. The first thing he does is bring back the remains of his mother and brothers.
Oh yeah, the grand public funeral. What a powerful symbolic act, right? I mean, it really resonated with the people who were so tired of Tiberius's cruelty. It's like he was saying, I'm not like him, I'm different.
Exactly. And he was also smart, politically savvy. He recalls the exiled senators, he gives bonuses to the military, and of course throws those lavish games and spectacles for the people.
And classic bread and circuses,
Ah,
right?
oh, yeah. Keep them entertained and they won't notice what's happening behind the scenes, or maybe they won't care as much. But with Caligula, at least at the beginning, you get the sense that his generosity was genuine, that he really wanted to, heal the wounds of the past, start fresh, and usher in this new golden age, an era of prosperity.
So everyone's happy, the empire's seemingly thriving. What could go wrong?
Right. Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because that's when things start to take a turn, a dark turn. And we start to see a shift in Caligula, a descent into what many historians describe as, well, madness.
Yeah, madness and tyranny.
Yeah.
So what happened? I mean, was there like a specific moment when things went off the rails?
It's hard to say for sure, but there are two events that historians often point to as potential turning points. First, about a year into his reign, Caligula gets really sick.
I was reading about this, and it sounded like the public was absolutely beside themselves, like convinced he was going to die, praying for his recovery, offering sacrifices.
Yeah, they were desperate to keep their beloved emperor alive, and when he recovers, it's like something is different. Some sources describe him as becoming really erratic, prone to these outbursts of anger, plagued by paranoia.
Like the illness flipped a switch.
Exactly, unleashing these darker impulses that he couldn't control anymore. And then there's the second turning point, the death of his sister, Drusilla.
Ah, yes. Their relationship. Well, let's just say it was the subject of much gossip and speculation back then.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that they were very close. And her death was a devastating blow to Caligula.
Yeah, he was inconsolable, totally lost it. He declared this period of public mourning where no one was allowed to, laugh or even bathe. It was really intense. He even deified her.
Made her a goddess.
Yeah.
The first Roman woman to be given that honor.
It was unprecedented. And I think it really shows the depth of his grief, a grief that maybe, bordered on obsession.
So we have these two possible triggers.
Yeah.
The illness, the death of his sister. And it's around this time that things really start to change. His actions become more erratic, and his treatment of the Senate, oh boy, it takes a really cruel turn.
Yeah, he goes from beloved emperor to, well, tyrant.
So let's talk about the Senate, because this is where those stories about Caligula's cruelty really start to take hold. I mean, he was merciless, wasn't he?
He was. And I think it stems from this, deep-seated paranoia. He starts seeing enemies everywhere, especially in the Senate, He sees them as these two-faced opportunists, people who turn on him just like they turned on his father and brothers.
He felt betrayed by them, and he was out for revenge.
Yeah. But it wasn't just about getting rid of them. It was like he enjoyed humiliating them, making them suffer.
Like making them run alongside his chariot for a mile.
Or forcing them to watch their sons be executed. Or demanding that they address him as a god.
I mean, talk about power tripping.
It's like he's trying to break them, to crush the very institution of the Senate, He wanted to be the only one in control. And this behavior wasn't just limited to the Senate. Caligula starts to indulge in all sorts of, well, excesses.
Lavish banquets, outrageous spending, public displays of, well, let's just say affection. That would have shocked even the most jaded Roman.
Yeah, I mean, even for Roman emperors who weren't exactly known for their restraint, Caligula's actions were considered scandalous. There are stories about him dressing up in crazy costumes, having very public relationships with his sisters, and even setting up a brothel in the imperial palace.
A brothel.
Yeah.
In the palace.
Yeah, it was like he was trying to push every boundary, testing the limits of what he could get away with. And then, of course, there's the god complex.
Right. Building a temple dedicated to himself, installing a golden statue of himself dressed as Jupiter, demanding to be worshipped as a god.
It was more than just ego, though. It was a way to consolidate power. I mean, what better way to ensure obedience than to position yourself as a god?
Makes sense. But was he really delusional? Did he actually believe he was divine? Or was it all just a power play?
It's hard to say for sure. Maybe it was a bit of both. And I think that's what makes Caligula so fascinating, this blurring of the lines between sanity and madness, between ambition and delusion.
It makes you wonder what happens when one person has that much power. Does it corrupt? Absolutely. Or does it just amplify what's already there?
It's a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. And to fully understand Caligula, I think we need to step back and look at the bigger picture, the cultural and religious landscape of Rome at that time.
Right, because he wasn't operating in a vacuum. His actions were both a reflection of and a reaction to, all the stuff that was happening around him.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about Caligula's descent into tyranny, his cruelty, his extravagance, his claims of divinity. But to really get a handle on all of this, I think we need to zoom out a bit. Look at the context, right? What was going on in Rome at the time? What forces might have been shaping his actions?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Rome in the first century AD, this wasn't some, simple society. It was a society in flux, dealing with all sorts of changes, social, economic, religious, and they were still grappling with, the ghosts of their own past, all the turmoil, the violence, the constant power struggles. So much drama. Take the Senate, for example. The institution that Caligula seemed so determined to humiliate. They weren't just some political body. They represented centuries of Roman tradition, the whole system of governance that had built an empire.
Right. And by going after the Senate, Caligula wasn't just attacking individuals, he was attacking the very foundations of Roman authority.
Like he was trying to dismantle the old system and build something new in its place. A system where the emperor had absolute power, where he didn't have to answer to anyone.
That's one way to look at it. Another interpretation is that Caligula was, simply a product of his time, a ruler shaped by this trend that was already happening, this move towards imperial absolutism, the emperor as a godlike figure.
Right. It goes all the way back to Augustus. He was a master at cultivating this image of himself as like a semi-divine ruler.
Yeah.
A descendant of the gods.
And the emperors who came after him, they followed that playbook. So when Caligula declared himself a god, he wasn't doing something totally out of the blue. He was just, taking things a bit further.
To the extreme, for sure. But here's the thing that I always find interesting. For all his talk about being a god, his extravagance, his cruelty, Caligula also did some practical stuff. Building roads, aqueducts, expanding the grain dole for the poor. He even abolished a really unpopular tax.
Those are the parts of his reign that often get overlooked. The stuff that doesn't fit the narrative of the crazy tyrant. It suggests that he wasn't just focused on himself, on, indulging his every whim. He understood that he needed to keep things running smoothly, appease the masses and all that.
So maybe there was a method to his madness. Some kind of twisted logic behind all the seemingly crazy stuff.
Possibly. But we also can't forget about the psychological impact of his childhood. That trauma of seeing his family destroyed, it doesn't just disappear, it leaves scars, shapes you. And it probably played a role in his decision-making.
Right. So we've got all these different factors at play. His personal experiences, the political landscape, and then the image he was trying to create, the legacy he wanted to leave behind. It's a lot to untangle.
It really is. And then on top of all that, most of what we know about Caligula comes from his enemies, the people who had every reason to make him look bad.
The senators, the historians, they paint this picture of him as a monster, a madman. But how much of that is true? And how much is just propaganda?
Yeah, exactly. Trying to justify his assassination, make him look like he deserved it. So we have to be really careful when we're reading these accounts. Look for the biases, for those little hints that might point to a more nuanced truth.
So after all this, after diving deep into all the sources, where do we land on Caligula? Was he a monster? A victim? A visionary? Or just some guy caught in the gears of history?
I don't think there's a simple answer. He was probably a mix of all those things. A man shaped by trauma, driven by ambition, and in the end, undone by his own excesses and, by the people who wanted him gone.
That's what makes his story so fascinating. He's like this mirror, reflecting all the complexities of power, the fragility of sanity, and just how hard it is to really understand what makes people tick, especially when they lived thousands of years ago.
His reign was short, turbulent, and for sure left a mark on history. And it reminds us that, even the most vilified figures deserve a second look, and that the past, well, it can still teach us something about ourselves if we're willing to listen.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into the life and times of Caligula. Clearly, 2,000 years later, he still has the power to fascinate, to provoke, to make us think about the nature of power and, the human condition. And if this deep dive sparked your curiosity, well, be sure to join us next time as we explore another corner of history, uncovering the stories that have shaped our world. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.